The wind had a way of speaking out in those lonely places where men go to forget they ever belonged to the world. And on one forgotten hill in the Montana Territory, that wind whispered through cracks in an old wooden house, brushing past the boots of a man who hadn't spoken to another soul in over 700 days. But tonight the wind brought company. 8 shadows stumbled through a snowstorm like ghosts who'd outrun hell. Eyes hollow clothes torn, and the youngest barely breathing cradled against her sister's chest. They weren't knocking on that door to ask. They were begging. Because this was the last house before the end of the world. Inside sat Thaddeus Mercer, 45, widowed, hardened by grief. A man who'd already buried everything he ever loved. The kind of man folks whispered about in town, that hermit up north, the one with the haunted eyes. He was done saving anything, or so he thought. Until the knock came. This is not a story about heroes in white hats or villains with curled mustaches. This is a story about a broken man and 8 broken children. And what happens when the law protects the wicked, and the only thing standing between innocence and oblivion is one man's grief, one girl's courage, and a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. And it all started with that knock. The kettle had long gone cold, but Thaddeus Mercer still sat there, elbows on the table, hands wrapped around a tin cup of silence. The beans on his plate had cooled hours ago, untouched, the steam having long given up trying to rise. Outside, the blizzard screamed against the weathered walls of his farmhouse, but Thad didn't flinch. He hadn't flinched in a long time. That's the thing about grief. It doesn't come like thunder. It seeps in quiet and cruel and teaches a man how to stop noticing time, or hunger, or seasons. And before you know it, you forget how to breathe like you used to, deep, full with hope in your lungs. 2 years. That's how long it had been since the fever came through Copper Ridge and stole everything that mattered. Margaret with her soft laugh and stubborn heart. Samuel and Joshua, twin boys with more mischief in their bones than sense. Thad had buried them himself in frozen earth behind the barn, the shovel trembling in his hands, not from cold, but from the sheer weight of loss. After that, the world narrowed to chores and silence. He fixed fences, he fed cattle. He mended roofs, not because he believed in tomorrow, but because it was easier than remembering yesterday. Neighbors stopped calling. He let them. The church sent letters. He burned them. Mercy came knocking once or twice, but grief answered the door, and mercy never came back. They say time heals, but for some time just wraps the wound in layers of routine until it doesn't bleed so loud. Thad didn't cry anymore. Didn't dream either. He just existed. But on that night, as the blizzard howled like a wolf at his door, something stirred. Not in the wind, not in the wood, but in him. A memory sharp and uninvited of Margaret humming in the kitchen, of little Samuel's muddy boots leaving prints on the floor, of Joshua's sleepy voice whispering, "Papa, is it safe now?" He blinked it away, heart clenching like a fist. And that's when the knock came. 3 taps, soft. Then another faster, more desperate. A voice high and cracking with cold cut through the wind like a cry from the grave. "Mister, please, we're freezing." Thad's hand hovered over the latch. He hadn't had a visitor in nearly a year. Not one who sounded like a child on the edge of dying. He should have ignored it. He almost did. But ghosts have a way of guiding you when you've lived with them long enough. And as his fingers closed around the latch, he felt something shift, not just in the air, but in his chest. Something like breath. Something like purpose. And that was the first moment Thaddeus Mercer came back to life. He didn't know yet that the knock would change everything, not just for him, but for 8 frightened souls standing on the edge of frost and fate. That part begins. the moment he opens the door. The wind hit him first, sharp as nails, thick with snow, roaring through the open door like a warning. Thad squinted into the white chaos, and for a heartbeat, he saw nothing but swirling emptiness. Then the shadows moved. 8 of them. Children. Thin, trembling, soaked to the bone. One girl, older, maybe 15, stood at the front arms, wrapped around a limp bundle no bigger than a sack of flour. A younger child, her sister maybe. Behind her, the rest huddled close, rag-wrapped feet, crunching in the snow, their eyes wide and wild, like deer that had been running too long. The oldest girl looked up at him, with fierce green eyes, rimmed with ice and fear. "Please, mister," she whispered, her voice nearly stolen by the wind. "We've been walking for days. The little ones, they can't go no further." Thad didn't speak. Couldn't. Because right then, he wasn't standing in a blizzard. He was back in that fevered week 2 winters ago, when Margaret laid cold on their bed and Samuel's tiny fingers slipped from his. When Joshua's final breath came with a whisper, "Papa." And now here they were, 8 ghosts that hadn't died yet. 8 reminders that innocence still existed, still cried out for help. Even if the world had stopped listening, he should have shut the door. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to send them on their way. Runaways meant questions, trouble, danger. And trouble had already visited him once and taken everything. But there was something in the way the girl held the unconscious child. Something in the way the smallest boy kept his body turned, shielding the others like a tiny soldier. Something that clawed past his grief and found the part of him that used to care. And so, before his brain could catch up with his heart, Thad stepped aside. "Get in," he said gruffly, his voice rusted from disuse. "Before you freeze to death." They moved like shadows across the threshold, quiet, unsure, grateful in a way words couldn't hold. Snow melted off them in wet puddles on his wooden floor. The littlest girl, Daisy, the older one called her, was laid near the stove. Skin-pale lips, blue, too weak to shiver. The others clustered around the warmth, their silence louder than screams. Thad stood by the door, the cold still biting his back, but his insides burning with questions. Who were they? Where had they come from? And why did that look in their eyes? Part terror, part hope, feel like a story he'd already lived. The answers would come soon enough, wrapped in bruises and whispers, in truths too dark for any child to carry. But for now, the storm had found them all. And something deeper than frost had begun to melt inside Thaddeus Mercer. The next truth. It would come with a name, Ruby May. The kitchen smelled of wet clothes and wood smoke, and for the first time in 2 years, Thaddeus Mercer didn't eat alone. He watched as the children, 8 strangers whose names he hadn't even asked, curled up near the stove, their small frames trembling in waves. Ruby May, the oldest, sat with her back straight despite her exhaustion, her arms still around Daisy, who hadn't stirred. Her eyes tracked Thad's every move, not with fear exactly, but with the watchfulness of someone who had learned the hard way that adults could be dangerous. Thad crouched near the pantry and pulled what little he had dried biscuits, a strip of smoked bacon and a jar of peach preserves. Margaret had canned the summer before she died. It wasn't enough, not for so many, but he offered it without a word. The children ate slowly, mechanically, like kids who had learned not to hope for second helpings. Finally, Thad broke the silence. "What's your name, girl?" "Ruby May Hollister," she said, her voice calm and clipped. "This here's Daisy. The rest, we're all from the same place." Thad nodded toward the others. "And where's that, the Riverside Home for Foundlings, sir?" 3 days' walk north. The name hit like a hammer. He'd heard whispers in town about Cornelius Wickham, a man who ran the home with a Bible in one hand and something far darker in the other. The children who came out of there never spoke much. Some didn't come out at all. You ran, Thod said quietly. Ruby May's jaw tensed. We had to. A small voice piped up a boy no older than 8. They was gonna sell Daisy to a man with gold teeth. Tommy Ruby whispered sharply. But it was too late. They said she was pretty. The boy continued, his voice shaking. Said she'd fetch a good price, and they was gonna hurt the older girls too. Said Ruby talked too much. Silence fell again, heavy as snow. Thod didn't move, didn't speak. But something in him cracked. This wasn't just poverty or neglect. This was slavery, children treated as property, bartered like cattle while the law looked the other way. How long were you there? He asked, though he already knew it would be too long. 2 years for most of us, Ruby May replied. They took us from towns when our folks died or couldn't feed us, said they'd give us homes. But she didn't finish. She didn't need to. Thod stared at the jar of preserves, now half empty, and thought of Margaret's hands tightening those lids. Thought of how she always said children weren't a burden. They were the future, and if you didn't protect them, you were just as guilty as the ones who hurt them. He looked back at Ruby May. They'll come for you, won't they? She nodded. Wickham don't let his property go. He'll send men, with guns, with dogs. The fire crackled behind them, but the air had grown cold again. Thod wasn't just sheltering 8 runaways anymore. He was standing at the edge of a war he never asked for, and it was coming fast. The knock didn't sound like a plea this time. It sounded like a demand. 3 hard raps against the door, slow and deliberate, as if whoever stood outside wasn't seeking entry, but already owned what lay inside. Thod rose from the chair where he'd been oiling his rifle, every muscle coiled in silence. Ruby May had frozen mid-sentence. The younger children flinched, eyes darting toward the windows, the corners, the shadows. That ain't them, Tommy whispered, his voice hoarse with dread. No one needed to say who them was. Thod moved to the window beside the door. Through the swirling snow, 4 shapes emerged, 3 riders in long coats and 1 figure dismounting with the precision of someone used to being obeyed. Tall, lean, with pale eyes that seemed to drink in the night. He knocked again. Open up, came the voice. Calm, authoritative, laced with something far worse than anger confidence. We're looking for runaways. 8 children. This farmhouse fits the tracks. Thod didn't open the door. Not yet. You got proof? Another voice, cooler, practiced, answered from the dark. I am Silas Crane, representative of the Riverside Home for Foundlings. These children are our legal wards. We have full authority to retrieve them, by any means necessary. Thod looked back at Ruby May. She was pale, lips pressed thin. That's him, she whispered. Wickham's man. Her arms tightened around Daisy's tiny frame. The others were already backing into the corners, like animals sensing fire. The name Crane had weight, and every child in the room seemed to know it. Can't stay here, Marcus murmured. They'll burn this place down if they have to. But Thod didn't move to hide. He stood straighter. For the first time in years, his grief didn't weigh him down. It anchored him. He turned to the door and raised his voice. I don't see any children here, and I don't recall inviting you onto my land. A pause. Then Crane's voice again, harder this time. We tracked them here, farmer. We've got papers, we've got men, and we've got 1 minute before we stop asking. Ruby May looked at Thod then, her eyes wide, filled with something between desperation and defiance. He'll kill you, she said quietly, just for helping us. Thod didn't answer. He already knew. Because monsters don't come with horns or claws. Sometimes they come with polished boots and notarized papers. Sometimes the law doesn't protect the innocent, it protects the men who write it. Outside, the wolves were no longer at the door. They were circling. And inside, a man who'd buried his family was about to find something worse than death. A reason to fight again. For 2 winters, the fire in Thod Mercer's hearth had been just that, wood and ash, nothing more. It warmed his hands, but never reached his heart. That night, though, it burned different. The children were pressed into the pantry and root cellar, the smallest tucked under blankets. Ruby May crouched by the window, Daisy asleep against her chest. Thod stood in the middle of the room, rifle in hand, watching the door as shadows flickered across the floorboards from the oil lamp. The silence was sharp. Waiting had a weight to it. A final knock cracked through the quiet. Then silence. Then splinters. The door shattered inward, wood flying like shrapnel. 3 men stormed in, guns drawn, eyes cold. Silas Crane stepped in last, slow and calm, like a vulture already full. His smile barely moved. "Well now," he said softly. "There they are." Thod didn't flinch. He leveled the rifle. "These children aren't going anywhere," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled not from fear, but from fury. Crane's chuckle was like glass breaking. "They're property, Mercer. We have contracts." You've got nothing." Thod's voice dropped. "I've got enough." And then the shot rang out, sharp and final. Crane stumbled back, shock etched into his face as red bloomed across his chest. The other 2 men reacted instantly, bullets flying. Thod dove behind the heavy oak table, dragging Ruby May and Daisy down with him. One bullet shattered a lamp, sending the room into sudden flickering darkness. The children screamed, but stayed low too, used to hiding, too practiced in surviving. One of the men advanced. Ruby May saw him first, barrel-chested and snarling. Before Thod could aim, a skillet flew across the room with a crack wielded by 12-year-old Moses, who'd waited behind the stove. The man dropped like a sack of bricks. But the second enforcer had circled to the kitchen door, his gun aimed low. "Drop it," he snarled, "or I start picking them off one by one." Thod froze, eyes on the gun, on the trembling form of little Beth behind the flour barrel. He lowered his rifle slowly. "You win." But Ruby May hadn't stopped moving. With the courage only desperation grants, she lunged for the knife on the counter, Thod's hunting blade. The man turned toward her just as Thod charged. They crashed to the ground, weapons clattering, fists flying. It wasn't skill that saved them. It was grief. It was rage. It was everything Thod had buried with his family rising in one wild burst. And in the end, it was Ruby May who drove the knife home. The man collapsed. The silence returned, except for the fire crackling steady. Except for Tommy coughing in the corner. Except for Daisy stirring softly in Ruby's arms. Thod sat back against the wall chest, heaving, the world spinning. He'd survived. They all had. But the farmhouse was no longer safe. Not anymore. Outside, the snow still fell, covering footprints and blood alike. And somewhere in the distance, hooves pounded against ice and earth, bringing more danger and no time left to mourn. It was time to run. The wind howled like a wounded beast as they stepped into the storm. Snow swirled in thick, blinding sheets, and the farmhouse behind them, once a tomb, then a battleground, vanished into the night as if it had never been. Thod didn't look back. He couldn't. Daisy lay wrapped in a thick blanket tied gently to his back. Her shallow breaths barely stirred the wool. Ruby May clutched Tommy close, each of his coughs tearing through the darkness like a reminder that time was running short. The others formed a tight cluster, faces buried in scarves and arms linked to keep from getting lost in the white void around them. The caves were 5 miles east, across frozen hills and through terrain that hadn't seen a soul in years. But it was shelter. It was a chance. Each step felt like dragging his boots through wet concrete. The cold sank into bones, numbed thoughts turned breath to ice. But Thad pressed on his boots, carving a path for 8 fragile hopes to follow. At one point, 10-year-old Beth stumbled into a drift and didn't get up. Marcus scooped her into his arms without a word and kept moving. No one spoke. Words wasted breath, and breath was life. Time twisted in the storm. It could have been hours, it could have been days. But then came the sound that shattered the silence. Hoofbeats, distant, then closer. Riders. Panic surged through the children. Ruby May's eyes snapped to Thad's. He didn't need to ask. She already knew. 3 miles to the caves, she whispered. He nodded. You know the way, I think so. He knelt beside her, pulled off his pack, handed her all the food, the water, the spare bullets. You take them, he said. Stay low. Move fast. Don't look back. Ruby's lip trembled, but she didn't argue. She knew. Deep down, they all did. Mister. She hesitated. Your name Thaddeus Mercer, he said softly. I had 2 sons, Samuel and Joshua, about your age. He touched Daisy's cheek, then looked to the rest of the children, each one exhausted, terrified, and depending on him. I won't let them take you. Then he turned and walked the opposite direction, loud on purpose. Cracking branches, dragging his feet, leaving a trail as easy to follow as if it were lit with lanterns. Behind him, the children disappeared into the dark, their path silent. His, loud. The bait. He didn't know if he'd survive. Truth was, he didn't care. But if this act, this sacrifice, bought those children one more chance, one more day, then it was the first decision in 2 years that made him feel alive. Somewhere in the dark, a new fire sparked. Not in a hearth, but in 8 hearts, learning what it meant to be protected for the first time in their lives. And somewhere far ahead, Ruby May clutched a sleeping child and whispered into the wind, We'll make it. We have to. The snow muffled everything, hoofbeats, breath, even fear. Ruby May crouched behind a boulder, one arm around little Daisy, the other gripping Marcus's hand tight. They'd made it to the foothills just short of the old mine shaft, not the caves themselves, but close enough to see the outline of the wooden beams peeking from under a snowdrift. The younger children were tucked deep into a crevice in the rock wall, hidden beneath cloaks and blankets. Their breaths came out shallow and quick, fogging the cold air like little ghosts. Ruby's eyes scanned the ridgeline. They'd circled back just like Thad had asked, No trusted them to. But Ruby hadn't gone far. Not with the sound of riders splitting the night behind them. Not with the weight of that sacrifice pressing down on her chest. She had to know he'd made it, that he hadn't done it for nothing. And that's when she saw them 6 riders, fanned out rifles across their saddles like claws. They moved with the practiced ease of men who'd hunted human prey before. No hurry, no fear. Predators. She counted their silhouettes just like Moses had taught her. She listened for the click of metal and the creak of saddle leather, things you notice when you've spent your life trying not to be noticed. We can't outrun them, Marcus whispered. His young face looked far too old in the moonlight. But maybe. He didn't finish the sentence. Ruby already knew. They wouldn't run. They'd fight. Ruby looked around at the small circle of children huddled together, some no older than 5. This wasn't their first escape. They'd survived dark cellars and cruel hands and cold floors. They knew how to be quiet, how to hide. But no one had ever taught them how to strike back. Until now. Moses and Marcus rolled loose rocks to the edge of the ridge above the trail. Beth and Jenny looped a rope between two trees with shaking hands. Ruby herself loaded the single rifle they'd stolen from Crane's dead man back at the farmhouse. It wasn't a plan born of strength. It was born of desperation and family. The kind of family forged in shared scars, not blood. And when the moment came when the first riders stepped into the kill zone, they didn't scream. They didn't cry. They acted. The trap sprung like a mountain lion, rocks crashing down a rifle shot echoing through the cliffs, and children moving with the wild, frantic precision of people who'd never had anything to lose until now. It was over in moments. 2 men crushed, 1 disarmed, 1 running. Ruby stood over the last, with a look that didn't belong on any 15-year-old's face. "You came hunting children," she said, the rifle steady in her arms. "You found something else?" And as Thad stumbled back toward the ridge, bloodied but alive, he saw them standing in the snow. Not runaways, not victims, but a pack. A family. And for the first time he realized maybe he hadn't saved them at all. Maybe they'd saved him. The snow had quieted by the time Thad reached the clearing. Gunpowder still hung in the air, faint and bitter. Broken branches littered the slope where the ambush had been. And the children, his children now, whether by blood or by choice, stood like shadows in the white dawn surrounding the bodies of the men who'd come to cage them. Ruby May lowered the rifle when she saw him, her arms trembling. Not from fear, from release. He didn't say a word. Just pulled her into a rough embrace, the kind a man gives when he's holding something too precious to speak about. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. And then, one by one, the others gathered around Daisy, clinging to his coat. Marcus pressing a bloodied rock into his hand, without explanation. Moses quietly setting a boot on the chest of the man he'd helped to stop from hurting Beth. These weren't the faces of orphans anymore. They were warriors. But Thad, he was just a farmer. A man who once tilled the earth because it was all he had left. A man who buried his heart beside his wife and sons and thought he'd buried his courage too. Until that knock. Until those eyes. Until a system so twisted it could forge legal documents to turn children into property gave him no choice but to fight. He looked down at the bodies in the snow, representatives of the law of order of everything a decent man was told to respect. Silas Crane, Morrison, men with paperwork badges, titles. But behind their names were broken ribs, bruised arms, whispers in the dark. Wickham had built his empire on silence and legality, and Thad had shattered both. "I never thought I'd be the kind of man who points a rifle at someone and pulls the trigger," he said softly, his voice hoarse from the cold and the truth. "But maybe that's the problem. Maybe too many of us never think we'd need to." He turned to Ruby May, who was watching him, not as a child watches an adult, but as an equal watches someone who's finally woken up. "I didn't kill the law today," he said. "I killed what the law forgot to protect." She nodded. And now what Thad looked around at the circle of children. At the mountain trail that led back to a broken house. At the sky streaked now with the faintest blush of sun. "We go home," he whispered. "We bury the dead. We fix what can be fixed. And we tell the truth to anyone willing to listen. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom. It comes from a farmhouse, porch, a trembling trigger finger, and the quiet vow of a man who's lost too much to stay silent any longer. And the story of that vow. That's what comes next." The old farmhouse didn't look like much when they came back. The front door still hung crooked on one hinge. Bullet holes pockmarked the wooden siding. Inside the kitchen bore the scars of war blood-stained floorboards. A shattered window, the table Thaddeus Mercer had flipped for cover, now lying in two splintered halves. But none of that mattered, because now there were voices in those rooms again. Not whispers of ghosts or the echo of empty footsteps, but laughter. Real laughter. The kind that bubbles up between spoonfuls of soup, between teasing and storytelling, and quiet nighttime songs hummed by candlelight. Thad stood in the doorway of the living room, watching Daisy and Jenny curl up together on a patchwork quilt in front of the fire. Beth was drawing horses on a scrap of old newspaper, her tongue poking out with concentration. Marcus and Moses argued again about who got the last piece of cornbread. And Ruby May, always watching, always holding the pieces together, caught his eye from across the room. He nodded. She smiled. It was different from before. The farmhouse still smelled of ash and cold air, and the grief hadn't vanished. It never really does. The portraits of Margaret Samuel and Joshua still hung above the mantel, silent witnesses to a life once lived. But they weren't watching a man fade anymore. They were watching a man return. There were hard days. Tommy's fever took a week to break. They had to burn the bloodied rugs and patch the holes in the roof before the next storm rolled in. Supplies were thin, and they took turns going to town in pairs, always cautious, always aware that Wickham's reach might not be fully severed, but there was peace in the work. There was joy in the rhythm. And little by little, the silence that had haunted Thad's home for 2 long years gave way to something stronger life. One night, after a long day of chopping wood and mending fences, Thad sat on the front porch with Ruby May beside him. The stars stretched wide above the kind of sky you only see in places far from the world's noise. "You think we'll be safe?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, not just a girl anymore, but the anchor of 8 lives, including his. "No," he answered honestly. "But we'll be together. And sometimes that's safer than any locked door." She nodded. "Feels like home?" He swallowed the lump in his throat. "It is." And as the wind rustled through the wheat field behind the house, it didn't sound like grief anymore. It sounded like children playing, like hammers on wood, like the beginning of something new rising from what had been broken. And tomorrow, they'd ride into it, together. The road stretched west, long and quiet, rimmed with the pale green of early spring. Snow still lingered in the shadows, but the sun had finally found its way back. Thaddeus Mercer sat tall in the saddle, the reins easy in his calloused hands. Behind him rode the children, no longer a huddled mass of orphans, but a caravan of beginnings. Ruby May led the second horse, her chin lifted toward the horizon. Marcus and Moses joked back and forth behind her, their laughter unburdened for the first time in years. Beth was singing to Daisy, who sat bundled in front of Thad, her tiny arms wrapped around his coat. Even Tommy Thin, still coughing now and then, had a spark in his eyes that wasn't there before. They rode not as fugitives anymore, but as a family bound by fire loss and choices that had nearly broken them. And yet, they'd endured. Peace hadn't come easy. It had cost blood. It had cost innocence. It had taken a man who thought he was already dead inside and asked him to rise again, not with vengeance, but with love. Not with law, but with conviction. Thad had killed for these children, lied for them, risked everything for a group of strangers who knocked on his door in the middle of a storm. And he would do it again. Because that's what family meant, not shared blood, but shared burdens, shared courage, shared healing. The law would never truly be on their side. Even with Wickham exposed, there would be whispers, rumors, questions that never got answered. But the children were safe now, and more than that, they were seen. They had names. They had stories. They had a future. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the valley below, Ruby May slowed her horse and looked over at Thad. "You sure about this?" she asked, voice barely louder than the breeze. Thad took in the distant ranch nestled in the folds of the land, a place owned by an old friend of Margaret's. Someone who'd offered them a new beginning, far from the shadows of Copper Ridge. "No," he said honestly. "But I'm sure we ain't going back." She smiled, and he realized then that her smile reminded him of Margaret's not in looks, but in strength. And as the group started down the hill, the sun broke through the clouds, completely casting long golden light across their path. Peace doesn't come wrapped in silence. It comes with a price. And sometimes that price is everything you thought you couldn't live without, until you remember why you're still breathing at all. So, if this story stirred something in you, if you believe that family is more than blood and courage isn't about being fearless but choosing to fight anyway, then hit that subscribe button, because every week we tell stories like this, of redemption, of grit, of quiet heroes who choose love over comfort and truth over safety. And if you want to hear what happens when a wounded outlaw returns to the town that betrayed him and the widow who never stopped believing in his soul, click the next video right here. You're not going to want to miss what comes next.